What's up everyone, my name is Rosendo, welcome back to my channel. We are back with another video, and today we're going to be taking a look at the progression of release. I believe this is something I talked about maybe 2 videos ago. I can't remember, I missed a week because I didn't record the video today. I had a few other things to do, so I missed a week, and I think the one before that was the simplest progression video, and the one before that was what is progression video. I think it's coming back to me now. Oh no, I had a night breakdown. That's why I'm confused. I had night breakdown. So that's what kind of threw a loop, kind of a wrench in things. Not a wrench in things, but it threw off my memory of what video we're on. Well, now we are on back to progression. I've probably, I think, made 2 progression videos at this point, and I talked about how I would break down the progression of release, which is exactly what I'm going to do today. We're going to be breaking down the progression of release. I think of all the tracks that I've made, release has it's a very, very good representation of what elements go into progression, unlike progress, where I think has a little bit more of a, not a complex, but a little bit of a different, more unique take on where the progression is. It's still a very good example of progression, but it does things in a different way. So that's why I think release is probably the track we want to look at here, other than something out of my Expression EP, maybe like Journey Beyond or something. But again, that's more of a complex track. Release is a very, very good standard track that we can take a look at. So again, welcome to the video. In case you're unfamiliar with what progression is, in this video, we're going to be talking about my track release and how the elements you choose and what elements you emphasize and what sounds you're hearing contribute to kind of what I call the progression of the track. And progression is just a general term for the rhythm and the change and the movement and the kind of in my eyes, kind of the liveliness of the track, kind of the life of the track. So that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be taking a look at release. We're going to be talking about all the elements. So without further ado, let's hop into FL Studio. All right, we are back in FL Studio taking a look at release again. Now, if you saw the track breakdown, and in my breakdowns, I talk a lot about kind of the meaning and the intention behind the tracks. And then I throw in things, you know, like the progression and sound selection and a bunch of other stuff. But today we are strictly talking about progression. So that's something I might do. I might have more breakdowns where I talk about the whys and the intention and, you know, what goes into the track. And, you know, still talk about progression, but today we're dedicating the entire video on progression. So if you saw my what is progression video, you remember that I defined progression in a very, very arbitrary way and in a very simple way that does not capture all the nuances, but I defined the progression as a variation in rhythm. Now, one of the nuances that doesn't capture is what element is emphasized in whatever section we're dealing with. So progression is, in its simplest form, in my eyes, a variation in rhythm, but also depending on what element we're emphasizing, that also contributes to basically whatever you're listening to. Whatever you're listening to in a certain part and whatever is being emphasized in that part, maybe alone or as a whole, that's kind of an element that when you vary that's where we get our progression. So we are on release now. We're going to talk about the progression of this track, why I think it's very interesting, why I think it brings out some good examples, and kind of some of the things that this track specifically does to change the progression, I guess not change the progression, but introduce progression and provide, at the end of the day, good progression, at least in my eyes. So what elements are we going to be talking about? There are 4 kind of main elements to any track that we're going to talk about here, which are going to be the drums, the bass. Those are kind of the 2 main ones. The drum and the bass do a lot of the work, especially when it comes to the rhythm. So the drums, the bass, we have the chords, and we have the melody. And not in no order. Chords and melody can kind of be interchanged. Melody's probably above the chords. But the chords, atmosphere, whatever else is going on in the background. The instruments, if you might even say, if you're dealing with guitars and a bunch of other stuff and pianos. But here we're dealing with electronic music, so chords and pads and all that stuff. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking a look at release and talking about how changing the emphasis, either changing those elements or changing what the emphasis is on, or how those elements work together, introduce progression into the track. So again, if you struggle with keeping your track interesting, if you're really good at having a track idea and maybe having a drop and not knowing where to go from there, or maybe you have the first half of the track and you don't know what to do for the second half or things like that, this is the video for you. We're going to be talking about how the elements that you have in your track can be changed to introduce progression. And we're going to be taking this from the beginning to the end. We're going to be doing this kind of in that order from beginning to end. We're not going to start in the middle and kind of reverse our way backwards. We're just going to start with the listening experience because we're imagining we're listening to this track. So we're starting with the listening experience, starting from the beginning right here. What do we get when we hit play on the track? We get the bass. This is what we're dealing with. So the intro of the track is really just the bass. Now, the bass itself, well, actually, you hear the pad, the chords, or whatever's playing in the background, just this atmosphere, actually, this ambience right here. But the bass, specifically in this case, is eighth notes. Sorry, the bass is actually 16th notes. I get those confused a lot. The bass is 16th notes. So that is what we start with the track. Now we're going to talk about what changes over here in a second. But right now the track is starting with 16th note, with a 16th note bass line, and all we're listening to is the bass. Right now the emphasis is really on the bass line, what we're going to call the rolling bass line, and that doesn't really change in the track. But right now the track, the intro and the emphasis is on the rolling bass line. And then we get the kick. So we get kind of now the kick and the bass line, which again introduces a progression. Now what happens here is kind of nice, especially if we listen to just the drums and the bass. So let's ignore the synths that are going to come in a second, the ARP, the main synths or whatever. Because when we're taking about the progression of just the intro, we're going to talk about the progression of just the intro, which is right here. We're going to consider this the intro of the track. If you're familiar with the track, it'll be nice and easy to follow along. Starting with just the rolling bass. So the progression looks like this. First, what is this? 8 bars. Rolling bass. That might be 4 bars. I think it's 4 bars. Next 4 bars. Kick and bass. And where do we go after that? Kick, snare. So this is kind of what we're dealing with here. We're introducing elements of, we're varying the rhythm and what the emphasis is on. Snare with the kick. We get an ARP as well, and the chords are really starting to swell up. Get more swelling, snare build up effectively. And that is the intro of the track. So the progression here, that again, what I want you to pay attention to is what elements are we emphasizing when we're trying to give your track progression. Let's say these drums weren't here. You would start with just the bass. You actually get this for 8 bars. And then you get the chords, you get the ARP in this background, but the actual rhythm hasn't changed itself too much because the rhythm, the emphasis of the rhythm is really just on the bass. And it really just doesn't do much of a job kind of building up. I mean, it does, but it really doesn't get the point across. It really doesn't introduce much significant progression. What is all this? Significant progression as it does now with the actual drums. So like I said, we have the kick snare, and then we basically effectively introduce a snare buildup into what we're going to call the breakdown. I sometimes call these verses. This is more of a breakdown, but we're going to call this a verse. And now we have a sustained bass. The big difference, however, is we introduce the melody as well. And like I said, the melody also has its own sense of rhythm to it, because before we're really just dealing with an 8th note. Let's meet the snare for a second. We're dealing with an 8th note bass line with a kick on every beat. That's kind of where the rhythm is at in our heads. Over here, without a rolling bass line, with a sustained bass line and no drums, now we can really focus on 2 things. Number 1, sustained energy, and combination, the sustained energy coming from the chords and the bass. So we have 2 things that are kind of our emphasis is on here. Number 1 is sustained energy, and number 2 is the progression of, the rhythm of the melody. Da-na-na-na-na-na-na. That's what we're listening to right now. So sustained energy plus a melody. We filter things down. And this is just kind of your standard build-up section. We do get the rhythmic bass back, and we do get a snare build-up. So the rhythm does change, where we're no longer just focused on the sustain, but we have here, 8th notes on the snare? 1, 2, yep. And the rolling bass line again. So again, the emphasis of the rhythm changed again, even though the melody is still there. So we actually do have more things going on. We have new rhythm with the melody as well, which we did not have over here. Into the drop, which delivers a very standard drop. Pay attention to what the emphasis is on here. In the drop, our emphasis is going to be on the kick snare pattern with, I would still argue it's with the sustained energy, especially with the sub being sustained, and we still have the rolling bass line here. But actually we have sidechain on it. That's another thing. We have sidechain on it, but the sustained sub really delivers the kind of the sustained energy here. Sidechain on the bass line also definitely emphasizes the kind of the on beat, especially with the kick and the snare. So that's where our emphasis is on here. Sustained energy plus kick snare pattern. Few fills here. Nothing that really changes the emphasis of the rhythm. So here when we have the emphasis on sustain energy and the kick snare pattern, where do we go from there? Sure, we throw in some hi-hats, but the real emphasis later comes from this new melody, the vocal chops here. This new vocal chop that introduces a little bit of a variation. So now that we have everything together, it's a whole new progression. And then we go on to second verse, but we're going to take a quick recap before we go on to verse number 2. Because what I want you to notice here, and this is really where the principle of progression comes into play, is that each section of the track has emphasis on a different part of the rhythm. At first, the emphasis was just on the rolling bass line. Then the emphasis was on the kick and the rolling bass line. And then the kick snare and the rolling bass line. And then this kind of standard snare buildup over here. Then the emphasis goes to just the sustained energy with the vocal chops and sustained basses and sustained super saws. Then we go into another buildup where the emphasis is really on that snare buildup plus the rolling bass again, plus the melody of and the rhythm of the vocal chops. And now the emphasis is on the kick, snare, and sustain energy, something that we didn't have earlier because over here we didn't have the super saws and the sustain sub and things like that. Over here we do, so that's where the emphasis is on over here. And now we have the exact same emphasis, but with the rhythm of the melody. So you'll notice that in the first half of the track, before the second verse, every single part has had a new point of emphasis on the rhythm, and that's really where the progression and the storytelling of your track can shine. So again, if you can start thinking about your track and as far as what element of the rhythm is being emphasized, you can unlock a lot of potential in arranging your tracks out. Which brings us to verse number 2, where we get something that sounds like this. So we get some fills here and some impact over here actually with these chords. What is this? Is it this? Nope, it is somewhere over here. So the emphasis is number 1. Well, let's take a look at this. If the emphasis over here was on the sustain energy, of course with the melody, we move on to bring the emphasis back to the rolling bass line. And now the emphasis is back on the kick snare with the rolling bass line. Now, it sounds very similar to what we had over here, where the emphasis is on the same thing. But without, the chords, this is where the chords and the melody and other things start to play a role, because here the emphasis is on the rolling bass line and the kick and the snare. Over here, the emphasis is also on the rolling bass line and the kick and the snare. But with the chords and a few other things, and especially with these stabs, it doesn't sound the same. Now, there's one also very important variable that I am not mentioning, which is where the sidechain plays a role. Over here, the emphasis was definitely on the kick and the rolling bass line. Take a listen. The rolling bass line is definitely pretty big major player there. Now, what happens when we go over here? The sidechain on the bass line just changes the rhythm enough that it just feels like the kick is really driving forward, and the bass line is still a major player, but it's a distinct rhythm. Even if we ignored all the other filler stuff that I was talking about, ignored the chords, ignored everything over here, it's still a different rhythm. Let's mute it and prove the point. Let's also sorry about that. Let's also mute these fills right here so you don't even hear the fills, and you can hear what the emphasis is on. Take a listen. Earlier, we had the emphasis on the kick and the bass like this. No sidechain on the bass. And over here, it's just a whole new rhythm. Again, without the fills, it's a whole new rhythm. And that is where your progression comes from. So where do we go from there? Emphasis is back on the kick and the rolling bass line with some fills, with a few other things, some stabs, a little bit more of an atmosphere going on. But with the sidechain, it's a whole new rhythm again. And then we move on. Yes, we do get some hi-hats, so the rhythm changes again. But we actually take the sidechain away, and that's another thing that changes the rhythm over here. We also get a melody. The melody introduces its own sense of rhythm. Let's emphasize this. It's an ARP, right? We get the melody from the ARP. So we have all this now. There we go. It's a whole new block of rhythm that we haven't had already. Plus, you get some fills, you got some stabs over here. Not only that, but if you saw the breakdown, another important aspect of this track was you might be able to tell right here, but if you haven't picked up on it, we changed how fast the chords are going as well. Sorry, how fast the notes are going as well. Here in this section, our bass note is what, 4 beats long before we switch? There we go. 4 beats. Over here, it's a 1/5 with 8 beats. This is also a 1/5, isn't it? Yeah, it's both a 1/5. But here the bass note is 8 beat long. The chord is 8 beats long. Here it is 4 beats long. That is another thing that we are doing to really introduce progression. So where over here, this is 4 beats. Over here, it is 8 beats, although we still have the sidechain. So it's still a very distinct area from this to this. From this to this. There we go. And then we take that, we take the speed of the rhythm, and we break it in half again, and it's faster. So we get it faster, more stabs, more rhythm. And where do we go from there? Again, the emphasis right here is on everything at once. But if we're talking just drum and bass, it's the non-sidechain rolling bass with the kick and snare pattern. And then next, the bass is gone. So the emphasis is just on the kick and the snare. So although you keep some elements of the melody, you actually introduce this ARP right here as well. But when we take the bass away, the emphasis of the rhythm changes again entirely, because again, we have the rolling bass line, the very powerful player right there, with the kick, with the sidechain especially, to really drive the track forward. And when we take it away, the rhythm changes entirely. It also allows us to do some nice things where we get intervals and new chords and things like that, and build it up to a little bit more of a, give it some tension, and release it so that we're back to the bass line. We're going to listen to this part entirely because I'm going to bring out kind of a whole new point of emphasis in a second. But again, we have another build-up pattern here. 8 beats on the bass line, vocal chops into the second drop. And listen to that emphasis right there. So here's the very interesting thing that we do in this part. This is what we're going to call the second buildup into the second drop versus the first buildup into the first drop. Here in the first buildup, we have this snare buildup, standard snare pattern with the rolling bass. But we have this vocal chop melody right here, what we're going to call melody number 1. And this is something I talked about in the breakdown, but I think dedicating a whole video to this is definitely worth it. Here we have melody number 1, vocal chop melody number 1. And here we have vocal chop melody number 2. So the other thing that we are doing here is in buildup number 1, we have vocal chop melody number 1. We deliver the drop, and then in the second half, we introduce vocal chop melody number 2. In the second buildup, we have vocal chop melody number 2. And in the drop, we introduce vocal chop melody number 1. So very interesting thing you can do. Very nice trick that you can do where if you have 2 melodies, in each drop you can use the different melody, the other melody. And the fact that in the buildup we have the other one as well makes it really nice. Now, of course, in the drop we have the bass line, the rolling bass line back again, and we have the snare on every other beat, which also changes the melody. Sure, these hi-hats, changes the rhythm. Sure, these hi-hats also change the rhythm as well. But it's also that nice detail of the melody that really pushes the track forward versus just having the snare on every beat and calling it a day. These things, these small things kind of make a big difference in the track. Brings us to our outro. That really introduced some really nice progression, which is why I think this is a very, very good example of progression here. Now let's take a listen to this outro. Pretty standard stuff. Let's see, is this exactly the same as what we had over here? Kind of. Now without the fills, with this crash and without the fills, and especially coming after a drop, the context plays a role and you know that you're kind of coming to an end. The other thing is there's actually no atmospheres over here, right? So without that's where the chords play a role, because over here, the pads and the atmosphere and the impacts and all that stuff and the fills still make it feel like you're a part of the track. But when the whole emphasis has been on the drums and the bass, and not the emphasis, but when a big emphasis on some of the major players have been the drum and the bass, ending the track with the same things you've been emphasizing the entire time definitely makes you feel like you're coming to an end, because it's just those major players left. Everything else has faded away. Everything else has come and gone, and it's come and gone, and it's climaxed and it's peaked, and then it's gone away. So just having those players right there just make a big difference to A, letting kind of contributing to the ending, and B, especially after drop, it lets you kind of know you're coming to an end because it comes after a climax versus kind of in the beginning where sure it was there, but now we're coming from a high point to a low point. So it serves as a really nice outro, bringing us to just the bass. Kind of similar to what we had earlier, but like I said, we're coming from a climax, and these vocal atmospheres also kind of introduce a little bit more of an atmosphere, a little bit more ambience, a little bit of emotion even, to let us know that we're coming to the end. So what is the big takeaway here? The big takeaway is, again, unlike something like Night, which I just broke down, this track has every single block of this track has its own emphasis on something unique of the rhythm, with kind of the exception of the outro, but that's because we're coming from a climax. But every part of this track has its own emphasis on something different, whether it's the intro, whether it's this breakdown / verse, the first build up, the second build up, the first half of the first drop, the second half of the first drop, the second drop, this area right here, the second verse, the second half of the second verse, this area where we drop the bass. Everything has its own emphasis on something unique, own emphasis on a different element of the rhythm, or how the different elements of the track work together. And that is what makes this track progression really, really nice, and something that you can definitely use in your tracks. All right, but that's about it. I know I didn't have a lot of structure to this, but A, I don't know how I would structure this, and B, if you were kind of committed and dedicated enough to follow along, you could learn a lot of nice things if this is all new to you. If kind of paying attention to what emphasis, what element of the rhythm the emphasis is on is new to you, and you struggle with arranging your tracks out, this is going to be a very good way of just, it's not necessarily a tutorial, but it's hopefully going to open your eyes and change your perspective on what you're listening to, how you can use progression in your tracks, and how different elements of the track can work together to tell a story, to emphasize something different, and to really bring, take a track idea from whether it's the drop or just one verse, and arrange it from start to finish. But as I said before, arranging is one of my favorite things. So if you guys have any questions, let me know. I will be as helpful as I can in the comments, because I really like to arrange. I can talk a lot about arranging. It's my favorite thing to do. So again, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. If you have any questions about progression, about this track, about any of the progression, any of my other tracks, also let me know. If this is something that you want to start using, if this is something that you don't use, if this is something that you haven't paid attention to, or you have paid attention to, again, drop it in the comments. I want this channel to be a place of discussion. You can let me know some of your favorite tracks that use this. You can let me know some of your tracks that you think would be better if they did have more progression, but all that sort of stuff. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Check out my Pawn 5 store if you're a content creator and you're in the market for an instrumental. But other than that, that is all I have for you. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.